Hey guys, what's going on? It's Alexander Williamson here with the secret history in your aquarium. So, today we're going to be talking about a question that I get all the time. And, the more I keep fish tanks, the less I seem to know about this subject. So, I decided to do some research, and obviously, having 30 or so tanks and just observing things, you also get a feel for it. But the question we're going to tackle today is, should you use a sand cap or a gravel cap, or allow a tank to develop its own cap with mulm by not gravel vacuuming? And what is the substrate you are using under it, and how much of it do you need? What are the pros and cons, and what are the benefits for plants versus what are the negative outcomes that can happen if you do it wrong, as well as how easy is it for your tank to become destabilized. So if you do a cap incorrectly, or you do a cap where there's a ton of active substrate with ammonia, nitrites, and nitrate in there for your plants, they may look great, but you may disrupt that cap and all of a sudden you can get a spike in things. So we're going to go over all that, look at some tanks, and figure out what's best for you based on all that information. So I hope this helps sort some of those questions out. Let's go inside where it's a lot warmer and discuss this now. All right, everybody, we are inside. Let's talk about caps. So first we need to talk about what a cap is. We should define that. So easy enough, a cap is any layer of sediment or substrate, as we'll call it, that separates your nutritional layer for your plants from the water column layer for your fish. Now, in very basic terms, your plant's roots go down, and they usually go a couple inches down. So what you would want there is either a aqua soil like ADA Amazonia or Fluval or EcoComplete. Fluval stratum is the one that most people use, or Brightwell. And you have either active or inactive types of those substrates. So if you're using an active substrate like EcoComplete or ADA Amazonas, what you'll see is these granules, these little balls like this, and they have ammonia, nitrites, nitrates, phosphorus, phosphates, all sorts of stuff that the plants in your aquarium will need. So what happens is, if that is going to be exposed at all to the water column, if water washes over it and leaches out of it, you need to protect your fish. And so one way to do that is by making sure that you have adequate biofiltration, so either a big old sponge filter or hang on the back or a big canister filter, any of those with adequate biological filtration that can handle any of the ammonia that's leaching out of that substrate. If you don't want to deal with that, if you don't want to wait a month to 2 months for an active substrate to cycle, you can actually use something like Fluval strata or stratum that has essentially all the minerals and all the pH buffers and things like that you would want in a tank, but it doesn't necessarily have the active organics that plants need. And so if you're going that route, you either need to add root tabs, or you need to allow the waste that your fish create. So in here you can see in this tank, the fish are creating poop, which then turns into mulm or algae or leaf debris or extra food that gets left over, and that then settles down just through gravity and through time and the motion of little microcurrents in your tank, as well as your creatures in your tank. That settles down. Now, if you're doing gravel vacuuming, I have a whole video on that, and the thing about capping your tank, it means that you can either safely gravel vac just the top layer of whether that be sand, gravel, silt, or aqua soils, but it limits you in that you definitely don't want to go deeper than that very top layer, because then you're going to allow the ammonia, the nitrites, the nitrates, the phosphates, things like that to leach out into your tank. So the other thing we need to consider in this whole process is, what's your cleanup crew? So if you just have shrimp in a tank, they're not going to put out much waste. And if you don't care if your plants are stem plants or carpeting plants or, like a lush aquascape, then you definitely don't need to worry about what your substrate is doing too much. It's basically just an anchor point for a lot of bulb plants, a lot of crypts. The crypts do need some sort of nutrients, so I would recommend either root tabs or mulm making its way down, which is just fish poop over time, as well as you can do supplements by putting those nutrients right into the water column with liquid fertilizers. But I want to show you guys a few different looks, and then we'll talk about how much of a cap you need to separate that organic matter from the layer of your fish, the water column layer. So basically, like you can see here in this tank, we've got gravel and sand low, then we've got a aqua soil that was active, so it had all the ammonia and nutrients and things. And then I put a good 1.5 inches or so of sand on top of that. Now, depending on how coarse your sand is, like pool filter sand or beach sand, play sand, you're going to want like 2 inches of that. If it's a little bit finer, you can go with 1 inch. And if it's the finest silter sand that you see that almost looks usually silvery with like quartzite and things like that in it, and it almost feels like a mud or a clay, that can actually cap a tank in as little as 1/2 inch. So what I like to do in that case, just to be safe, is to allow that silt and sand that's really fine to settle in, and then and let some of it fall in between the rocks and the gravel, the pea gravel or small gravel that I put in, and then I'll cap it with sand for 1 inch, just for looks and just for the sake of there being another little boundary other than that thin layer. But in theory, I have definitely run tanks where you allow the substrate to just create its own silt or mulm layer, and you can see on this tank right here where that begins. Now, I can show you on a tank that's much more reliant on plants and needs much more organic matter, ammonia, nitrites, nitrates, phosphates, iron, all the different things that you would use as fertilizer for your plants. Let me show you a tank that's running on a whole lot of need for that. And usually those are going to be higher light tanks and tanks that are more for like aquascaping or jungle style. In this tank, it's a little deceiving. I do have a few stem plants, but most of these plants like Sawassertang or the water lilies or lotuses, the guppy grass, all that stuff can just live with nutrients in the water column. So the fish using the bathroom daily, if you have a densely packed tank, is plenty of nutrients for those plants, especially for slow growing water column feeders. But if you have stem plants or fast growing plants, then you definitely want a cap system where you lock in that nutrients and keep it going. So let me show you the other system, and there's 2 ways to do this other system. Alright, so here we can see one of those other systems, which is a really lush tank, about as packed as you can get with plants. It doesn't have any carpeting plants, but it does have a lot of stem plants. And so what I did here, and it's been running for 3 years now, is I did sand, then a layer of pea gravel or tiny rocks, and then I did a layer of just actually about 2 inches of the substrate known as Fluval stratum, and then Amazonas ADA. So the Amazonas has that nitrate, nitrite, ammonia, and all sorts of minerals in it, whereas Fluval stratum and things like some of the shrimp, some like Brightwell substrates, some of the shrimp designed ones, they will have the minerals and the KH and GH additives, which will help stabilize your water column, but they won't have those organic compounds that really allow your plants to get bright colors and to grow quickly and grow densely. So obviously CO2 can really help with things also. Right now I'm not running CO2 on this tank, but down here you can see there's no cap. So what I had to do, since this is a mix of active substrate, and I have a whole video on how to switch out substrates if you have an active substrate, and that active substrate thing that I'm talking about means that you have ammonia and nitrites, nitrates, phosphates, things that can spike algae and bacterial blooms, as well as they're good for feeding your plants, but they're best feeding them in the roots, and they will cause harm to your fish. So you can either do one of two things, which is have a very big filter for the size of your tank. So this one has a hang off the back filter. Right now I'm only running it on half of the system because it's an old tank that's very well cycled. Now your surface area in your tank is another thing to consider, because in tanks like this, actually rounded little surface area, each rounded thing has more surface area than, say, a flat layer of sand. And so that flat layer would only have basically a flat one-dimensional amount of beneficial bacteria. Whereas we know that when you use something like filter floss, it is full of surface area, so it's good for growing more beneficial bacteria, which eats that ammonia, the nitrites, and puts out nitrates. Now you can also use root tabs too, but if you're using root tabs, that's why you're going to want a cap, and we'll talk about how much of a cap you need right at the end here of each type of substrate. But another little tip I want to give you is that when you look at how your tank is stratifying, when you have a growth of green to bluish colored bacteria or algae, sometimes it's called blue-green algae, it almost looks kind of metallic or shimmery. Sometimes it's a dark red or auburn color, kind of almost crimson-y brown to dark purple, but both of those are going to be bacteria that are thriving because there's no oxygen or very little oxygen, which we call anoxic or anaerobic conditions. So you can tell in this tank that the cap is effective in keeping the oxygen out of the substrate to right around here. You can actually track where that is based on that. Now sometimes there are cyanobacteria that will grow up and out of the tank, and you'll see them growing onto plants and things, and that's an actual different species that likes to live in oxygen. But in this tank you can see you can put as much as 9 inches in the back, or you could do the whole thing if you wanted to, but it's a waste of a tank of substrate. Now when you do that, you definitely want to layer it, because plants are most at home with a dense layer and then a looser layer where they can get nutrients from, if they're over here, their runner roots can make it through there quicker, and all the little fibery roots, whereas the tap root will go straight down and anchor it. So having those different layers will allow your plants to be more anchored. Having a cap on it, though, will allow your plants to kind of sit in place from the very start. Whereas if you're using these eco soils that are so great for aquascaping and carpeting, basically this whole top layer is really loose, and so stem plants and things will float away. And if you were to kick this all up right now, you'd get a big ammonia spike. And that would be because all that nutrients is locked into this substrate. And you can see where the fish poop and the soil has broken down and turned into a silt layer and is forming the cap in this tank. So the cap's not always on top. The cap is wherever your tank separates its active nutrients, which obviously, again, that they harm fish in the water column, wherever that is separated from the inactive substrate, which doesn't harm your plants. I have a whole video on gravel vacuuming and the use of snails like these Malaysian trumpet snails, which churn up that top layer above the cap. And you can watch that if you'd like, because a lot of people gravel vac wanting a spotless tank and actually unwittingly never allow that biofiltration in the top layer to form, and the ammonia and the ammonium that leaches out of there actually keeps getting released for months and months. So they need much more biofiltration, bigger filters, and more plants to keep it safe for the fish. Whereas if you just let it cycle and let it sit, you don't necessarily need a cap, but you need to wait a month to 2 months if you're using pure active substrate like these, like Amazonas or Amazonia substrate, which is great for the plants again, but it's harmful to the fish at first. So you either need, like 2 big old filters for a tank like this running nonstop, plus a ton of plants eating those nutrients before you can put fish in, or you need to let it wait for a month to 2 months until you're reading 0 ammonia in the water. And then you don't want to disturb that layer pretty much ever, other than, swapping a plant or 2 around. So let's finish up with how much of a cap you really need of each of these substances. So again, I have just about every kind of tank you can think of, from glass bottom to deep substrate to anoxic filtration to to all the old standard oldies but goodies. Now this is a tank that has a glass bottom, and what mulm and plant debris builds up over about 2 years. So over time you'll actually get those layers. And what's going on in a sandy tank like this one is all that poop and waste and plant debris and tannins and leaf and all whatever matter is falling in the tank. It works its way to the bottom somewhat, but most people would gravel vac a tank that is this shallow. And I do so. I gravel vac that top layer. But naturally, what's kind of cool is your tank actually draws in nutrients to the plants. That's why plant root wells actually draw in just through physics, because the sand around it kind of creates a little trap. They build up, the waste builds up around it, and so that's nutrients going to your plants. Now if you have a deep substrate and a cap, it'll work through that cap over time, and in the meantime, while it is slightly toxic for say a week, your biological filtration will handle it. And if you have rounder, substrate that's small, round sizes, you have a lot of surface area. If you have tiny granules of sand that act as a solid surface, basically, and kind of lock into one another, you actually have less surface area. So big grains of sand actually give you some biofiltration, because the bacteria will live on there as well as in your filters. And with these tanks, you can decide what kind of a cap you want to put on it. Now, over time, any substrate will become non-toxic. It loses its nutrients, especially when you're doing water changes and the plants are eating from that substrate. So if you have, say, cichlids or catfish that just constantly kick up the substrate and pull it up all the way to the glass bottom, then you can gravel vac as much as your heart wants on your substrate. But if it's any amount of layer that below that doesn't get disturbed and locks in, so here actually we have a layer developing of nutrients from mulm, from poop and algae and plant debris and food, and that is what the roots of these plants will be feeding off of, even though most of these plants are very heavy water column feeders. So if you're going to cap your tank, last time we'll go over it, you want to use at least 1 inch of sand if it's fine sand, 2 inches if it's a coarser sand, 3 inches if it's a pea gravel, 4 inches if it's a big chunky gravel. And if it's an aqua soil, you want to make sure that the ammonia and nitrites have leached off if it has those. And then you can use about 2 inches to 2.5 inches of that to act as a cap. And over time, it will break down and become more of a less of little granules and more of a actual silt or sandy kind of texture. And then it becomes a cap very quickly. Like I showed you in that tank in the beginning, it can cap things off in as little as 1/2 inch or maybe even less. So I hope this helps you guys decide how you're going to run your tanks, and if you need to gravel vac even. But I have a video that goes more in depth on that, because your substrate is also your filtration, not just your energy reservoir for your plants and biofiltration for your fish. If you guys like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you made it this far, it helps the video spread. I really appreciate it. You can support the channel by subscribing, and we'll let you know when new videos come out. About 4 times a week we've got content coming out here. And also, you can join as a member if you want to support the channel even more and get a look behind the scenes and extra content. So thank you so much. Membership's only $1.99, and it really helps me, decide on what I can afford to buy or add to the fish room and camera gear and whatnot. All right, guys, have a good one and take care. Bye.